This is Health on the Plains, a podcast about rural communities, rural life, and the many factors influencing the health and well-being of rural Kansans. Health on the Plains is a podcast from the Kansas Health Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational organization committed to informing policy and improving health in Kansas. Through honest, nuanced conversations with leaders and doers from a variety of backgrounds, the Health on the Plains podcast offers unique insights into rural health challenges in Kansas and shines a light on the people and organizations working to make their communities healthier, more vibrant places to call home.
Welcome back to another episode of Health on the Plains. We are here in the country outside of Inman, Kansas, and we are at the offices and the event space of the Kansas Sampler Foundation. We just wrapped up a wonderful conversation with their co-directors, Sarah Green and Marcy Penner. We talked some about the history of the Kansas Sampler Foundation, the work they do to shift how we think about and how we view our rural communities to empower especially those small rural communities and the young adults that are rural by choice that live there and want to see those communities thrive. It's a really wide-ranging conversation that really gets into some of the key challenges, opportunities, and values embedded in engaging work to make thriving rural communities here in Kansas. I hope you enjoy. Welcome back to another episode of Health on the Plains. I'm your host, Wyatt Beckman. Today, we are just outside Inman, Kansas, and for this episode we have two wonderful guests, Marcy Penner and Sarah Green. Marcy and Sarah are co-directors of the Kansas Sampler Foundation, which is where we're at right now. Marcy has been with the foundation since its founding, and the space we sit in today is built on the Penner family farm. In 2023, Sarah joined, and Marcy and Sarah became co-directors. And Sarah joined with 2 decades of work and experiences in public service, journalism, consulting, all right here in Kansas. The Kansas Sampler Foundation is a public nonprofit organization that is committed to serving and supporting rural communities with the goal to keep every town viable that shows the will and spirit to help itself. Some of the recognizable work the Kansas Sampler Foundation does includes the Kansas Explorers Club, the Kansas Guidebook, the Big Kansas Road Trip, the 8 Wonders of Kansas, and the Big Rural Brainstorm. There's a lot for us to dive in today, and we're super excited to have you both on the podcast. Thank you both for joining us.
Great to be with you.
So the roots of the Kansas Sampler Foundation go back to the summer of 1990 and a road trip that you took with your father. So for those that are a little less familiar, can you tell us a little bit about the history of the Kansas Sampler Foundation?
Yeah, I had just moved back to Kansas, and Dad and I decided to travel the state to see what we would see. He had written some coffee table photo essay books, and people would say, "How do you get to those places?" So we went out, but it was this road trip that led to all that's happening today, because we met people in their place and we listened, and then people started asking us to do programs after the guidebooks came out. So we got to deal with the audience as well as the people in rural communities, and it led to a nonprofit to educate Kansans about Kansas because they didn't know their own state very well, but also to network and support rural communities. Back then, without social media and other things, it was harder to share success avenues. So that's how it started.
And now it's grown into this great organization that's been around for 30 years. You recently just celebrated 30-year anniversary.
We did, which would be 1993 as a start. So those first early years were just Dad and I doing Dad and I things.
Well, that's wonderful. And thanks for the little bit of the history. And we're going to talk a lot about the work you do and the approach to the work you do, because you have lots of different programs and efforts. And I want to start sort of with what you have built into your mission. You say the mission is to preserve and sustain rural culture by educating Kansans about Kansas, as you said, and networking to support rural communities. So how do you think about rural culture? What does that mean to you and to the work?
It means something very specific to us. So Dad and I would go around and would say, what do you have in your town that we could put in a guidebook? They would say, we don't have anything, go to the next town. So we came up with these 8 things that every town has. Even if there's no evidence left, they have a story to tell. And these 8 elements in combination are what we call rural culture. So in alphabetical order, they're architecture, art, commerce, cuisine, customs, geography, history, and people. So when you go into a town, you can like architecture is, what do the buildings look like? In Ness City, you've got the limestone, and in Atchison, it's more red brick. And those categories help you think about how towns are different and the same, but we get to frame our work around those 8 different categories. So that's really every aspect of rural. So that has given us permission to work with everything from preservation and restoration to art to supporting grocery stores and restaurants. And it helped broaden our view and our work.
That's awesome. And you rattled them off. You probably have them.
I've said them a few times.
I've said them a few times. Yeah. And we have, are those connected to the 8 wonders?
They're exactly that. So you do know that it used to be the 7 wonders of the world, but we decided to do the 8 wonders of Kansas and in a way to educate Kansans. So we did a campaign for each element on its own and did contests and led to a guidebook. And I think it did, now people don't even know we did the 8 wonders. It's just sort of in the fabric of Kansas that we have the 8 wonders of Kansas.
Yeah, and I grew up in Ness City, and we have one of the 8 wonders.
Of architecture.
Of architecture specifically, our old bank building, big, beautiful limestone building. And I remember at a certain point when I learned about the 8 wonders, it did make me think about, this was a pretty unique thing that I, in a lot of ways, took for granted as a kid. It was the big building downtown. It was where we had prom on the 3rd floor. But I don't know that I appreciated it the way I could have. And it seems like part of the work of the 8 wonders, but even the work more broadly of the foundation is to help people appreciate what we have in Kansas, and especially what we have in those rural communities where we might be inclined to first think about what we don't have.
Right.
Do you think that that's important? That's an important shift to facilitate a lot of the sustainability and the idea of building communities for the future is how they see themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, how can a town like itself, which we hope a community of the future does, if they aren't proud of who they are and what they have? And in the case of what you just said, you sometimes don't see what's under your own nose until it gets put into a context of this is special and people are coming to see it. And I think we just need those nudges, especially in Kansas that gets a bad rep about what we don't have, who we aren't.
Well, so we even have a whole program area called Seeing Kansas with New Eyes. And we could have called it something else, but we picked that name on purpose because this idea that there are things to see that are worthy, that are beautiful, but maybe they need a nudge or somebody from the outside coming in and being like, that is amazing. And we get to do that.
I just want to add that all of this helps show that people care about rural. I think that's the bottom line. See it with new eyes. Don't just think about the stereotype or what people joke about, we want people to know that they should care about rural, even the people that live there. And then you got the urban, but if you don't share the story and all the nuances, how would you care about something? You have to make the case.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, and I think this is true, that when we talk about how we might have some misperceptions or think about rural communities, sometimes that's framed as how people that don't live in rural communities view rural communities, but it can also include how folks inside of our own communities view themselves. It sounds like that's can be just as important for facilitating the work to improve those communities, is that I would think you can do both at the same time. You can say, we have great things here, and we want to make it better. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes you need the first to be willing to work on the second. So I want to hear some about some of your key program areas. And you have 4 key program areas. And one of them really centers around young people. Mm-hmm. And you started a project and an effort that you called the Power Up Movement. And you defined Power Ups as individuals aged 21 to 39 who are rural by choice. So they're choosing to be in their communities, in those rural places. So why the focus on rural, or why the focus on young people in rural communities? Why are they so important?
On my guidebook 1, Journey to Every Town in the State in the early 2000s, this is the great thing about actually being out there. I noticed it became a trend that in the towns where I met young people that were either leaders or in businesses, that town had a different energy. And it became true across the state. And as I traveled, I remembered who they were. And after the journey, it seemed like, okay, this is something. Let's bring some of those folks together and see what they think. And I forgot what year it was, maybe 12, 15 years ago. But they got together and they started to talk about all these things that were true for each of them. Like some of them had moved back by choice after being gone, having an education. But people in the town made them feel like they were losers. Why did you have to move back? What are you doing here in a town like this? It was their choice, but that's the reception they got. Or they wanted to make a difference in their town. And sometimes the older leaders don't let you do that. And that was a common theme. Or they wanted to meet other young people with that same passion for living rural. So we decided to call it something. We gave them the name, the Power Ups, and started bringing more and more together. And magical things started to happen, which we could do a whole podcast on the rogue meeting that happened and how we brought these people forward at conferences we did. But it was goosebumping once that group was identified as a valuable part of rural that had been invisible. And our goal, not just us, but the group, realized that if we could elevate, empower, engage these power-ups, we could make rural a better place. And it's an ongoing process. It's not easy. Do you want to add anything to that? It's so interesting. So we talk about the journey. Mm-hmm. Everything is a journey. Rural Kansas is a journey. The Power Up movement is definitely a journey. It started as, it's very loose. There are tenets and there's a structure to it. But over time, I always sort of thought, before I aged out of being a Power Up, I always thought it was almost like a chamber of commerce, but not located in a city. But all of a sudden, you had connections for support, for jobs,
Is there somebody who's a web designer? Is there somebody who does t-shirts? Like who do I know? They don't have to be in my town. Or maybe I know that person in my town, but I can't work with them for whatever reason, but I have this other person I can. And so the network component of it is the magical piece.
And you became friends.
Oh,
it wasn't just
yes.
work. It was like,
I always say, once I got with the power ups, I never sat at a meeting alone again.
mm-hmm.
It's special. And it's, we went out, some of us still get together. We went somewhere and somebody, was like, oh, I'm from Tribune. I'm from, Abilene, just saying where they were from. And people are always like,
how do you all know each other?
Related? Is this like a family reunion? But it is, it's one of the strongest groups that maybe you met through your job, but it's not like a conference or something that's so focused on your job. It's like seeing people for what you do, but more who you are.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many interesting things I can pull on in that. And one that stands out is we talked about earlier the influence and the importance of how communities see themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And when you started talking about the history of it, talked about that experience that folks that are these power-ups can sometimes feel when they move back,
mm-hmm.
and how it's seen as sort of, well, you tried to have the bigger, better, and now you're back. And it sounds like that could feel kind of isolating
mm-hmm.
for a rural, a young power-up that's in this early career age group that made the choice to come back, to feel like they're seen as sort of giving up or choosing a easier route, or whatever that misperception can be. And I think it sounds like all of the work tries to chip away at those perceptions of how you view
mm-hmm.
themselves. But even while that's happening, connecting these folks can help it not feel so isolating. And you can learn and swap stories, and you can share experiences and figure out how to advance the work. So it sounds like I can see how there would be an immense value, even if you're the only one in your community, and connecting with someone else that has some of that similar experience.
And then think about it. If a person is moving back young being pretty subjective and relative, but like say they went to Chicago or Dallas or wherever from a rural community, and then they're moving back, they're getting it from both ways, right? Like no one is like, good for you. The people from the city where they lived are often like, why would you do that to yourself? And then the people from their hometown or wherever the community is, why are you here?
You couldn't make it.
Yeah. So you're overcoming a lot to even make that choice, even if it's one you want. And we know people do want it as a choice. What
a great insight that perception comes from both, can come from
mm-hmm.
both sides. And so having the ability to turn, even if it's virtually sometimes, to turn and lean on someone and say, this is worth it. This is great. We're going to overcome some of these challenges together. And how did you respond to this person when they asked you this sort of question? That can help that person stay engaged and keep going.
I mean, just think about all those people from Chicago or wherever getting together and seeing a group that all had the same feeling, that somehow rural meant something to them. And this group, they all understood each other. So they finally felt valued and validated and then seen. And then that group sort of acted as a block of promotion for rural. Like the legislators, they went to a legislative caucus, and so many things out of that were not just nice, but important, impactful, changing lives.
Absolutely. And I want to connect that to one of the pieces that seems to have come out of this work. And And that's the collaboration you had with the Office of Rural Prosperity to get some of this, in a report and take it to another level. And in 2021, you interviewed 175 of these folks in this age group from all 105 counties, and you put it together in a great report that identified a lot of those challenges that some of these folks are encountering and some of the successes and ways that communities are supporting them. And there were a ton of great insights in that report. But one thing stood out to me that I wanted to ask you about. There was a quote that you pulled out from all of the things you heard as an example that you wanted to highlight. And it was from one of the participants. And the quote is, "All I want is a salad with some nice lettuce and soft serve ice cream for my kids." So why, out of all the things you heard, was that the quote that's...
Well, to me, it symbolized we don't need everything. I don't need this town to have entertainment venues and nice restaurants. All I want is some fresh lettuce and soft serve ice cream. So it was just sort of like, I can deal with everything. All the things we don't have. I just want some simple things. And that symbolized to me what I heard from many of those 175, that it's okay not to have everything Chicago has, because I'm choosing this. I want this. But some simple things are on my mind.
I sometimes think that along those lines, when we talk about rural communities and rural towns, we don't want them to just be smaller versions of cities. And I think sometimes when we talk about improving our rural communities, our entry into the conversation is like, how do we take everything in a big city and just downsize it and put it in a rural community? And I don't think that's what, if it sounds like when you talk to folks in these rural communities, that's not what they want. They don't want their rural community to be those other places. They want it to be what it is. And part of the 8 Wonders work and some of the other work is helping identify and celebrate the unique things in those communities.
It's very surprising what is really on people's minds. We went to a town over the summer. They have a cafe, like I would say, co-located in a gas station and a convenience store. So it's the grocery store, it's the cafe, it's the coffee shop, it's everything. And so we're going through town and just looking for people to talk to. We stopped in and talked to some people who live there. And even in this small group of the two or three people kind of in and out of this conversation, the way they saw their community was very different depending on all of their lived experience. But when we said, what does this town need? A splash pad. Because the kids needed a place to go in the summer to cool off. No swimming pool.
They didn't really have any businesses even.
No. But that was it. And that's achievable.
Yeah.
We can do that.
Yeah.
And do you think that was because they wanted the sense of community?
Yes.
From that, not, we can go somewhere else to buy clothing or
we're already doing our errands
Yeah.
and wherever when
What a
we're
splash pad.
Yeah. And then just thinking about they have all the infrastructure needed if they could get the, actual technical place set up. The kids are already riding their bikes all over the place. They have enough ways to access it. They would probably not put it on the other side of the highway. There's space in town. All of these barriers that other places are trying to figure out how to overcome, they don't exist. It's ready.
And what I hear in that too, that's a great little example. I would bet that in a lot of situations, if we would take that same town and we would take a group of folks that are not from that community and maybe from another side of the state or from another place, and we'd take them to that town and we'd say, look at this town and what does it need? that's probably not what they're going to come up with. And it just emphasizes the immense value and importance of listening to the folks in the community and creating ways for them to identify and work collectively to achieve some of the challenges that they identify in their priorities, and those often look different than what we might think from the outside.
What you can't see when you drive through that town is that the community likes itself. You can't see that. So if you're, like you suggest, someone from somewhere else drives through, they go, I don't want to live here. But the people that live there, they love living there because they do things for each other. And sometimes it's the things you can't see that really make a town a community.
Absolutely. And I want to ask about another one of your project areas that I think builds on and it seems to focus in particular on some of the communities like that are particularly small. And you have an area that is focused on the idea of connecting, and that's broadly connections for lots of communities. But within that area, you focus on those communities less than 1,500 people. Places like Inman that we drove through on the way here, places like Ness City where I'm from. And it turns out that Kansas has a lot of those places, a lot of those communities. I looked at census data and the most recent 2022 estimates, and of the 626 incorporated places in Kansas, 143 have a population of 1,500 or more. So that's only 23%.
Yeah.
So said another way, 77% of the cities in Kansas, those incorporated places that are recognized by the state and by the census, have fewer than 1,500 people. That's a lot of places. And like most adages and generalizations, there's ideas that we say, small town, everyone knows everyone. And I think that's an overgeneralization. But there's some truth in it. But one thing that you pointed out that is not the idea that everyone knows everyone, but is maybe a hidden piece in what the fabric of those communities is that they're volunteer-led. And tell me what that means and how that shapes some of the work they do. Because I think that's another example of something that someone driving through might go, small town, I bet they all know each other, and have some thoughts about what that means. But they might not think about the impact of this volunteer-led piece. So what does that mean?
So we're talking like over 470 towns that are volunteer-led. The vast majority of them do not have a paid city manager, chamber, eco-devo. To sustain a small town is hard enough, but to put that on the backs of volunteers who aren't trained to do that, who maybe never went to college, maybe never left the town, it's on them to figure out how to keep the water, the sewer, all these things. It's really difficult. And when Dad and I started, we realized that group wasn't being recognized as for their special characteristics. They were more looked at as, well, it wouldn't hurt if we lost that town. Or that town doesn't matter that much. They didn't have an identity. They didn't have the respect that they deserve for trying to stay alive. And your opening comment was that we support communities that have the will and gumption. So there are some towns in that grouping who don't care. In fact, one town wanted to unincorporate, and they couldn't even get enough of a quorum together to vote themselves into incorporation. So we weren't going to put our efforts into a town like that, but it has nothing to do with population in terms of which towns care about themselves enough. And it goes in cycles. People die, people come in, and when we find a town full of community doers that love their town and they want to have dreams and goals, man, we're there for them.
And I think that's another really important piece of this. We talk a lot about capacity in rural communities, and that means a lot of different things. But if there isn't a person whose job it is to be in charge of the town, but maybe that's shared across quite a few people, there's also not always someone, they're working on today's stuff. How do we get a new electric grid? How are we going to fund our fill in the blank? Like, how do we keep our parks mowed? Whatever it is, that's their work. Whether or not they're compensated for it, that's their work. They're maxed out, and they may not be thinking about the future. It's no one's job in town to be like, okay, here's where we are today. I think we could go somewhere. That person, we want to find that person. And you don't know if that person exists when you drive in to a place. You have to do some poking around to find them. But it's a consequence of just the structure of how communities function sometimes.
And that volunteer-led piece really is a neat way of capturing that combination of factors. And like, you drive into one of those communities, and you can't point to the office place where the planning commission that's drafting the 2040 city plan together. There's no office, there's no person. And so that work, if someone is interested in doing it, falls on their free time or their volunteer time, where it's a combination of us trying to work together and piece this together. And that can be really challenging, I can imagine. And so part of the work that you all try to do is connect and support those folks. Especially
all of our programs are designed for the volunteer-led communities. If others want to, but with your policy work, I think another thing that's important to hear is that, like, if the Office of Rural Prosperity has a grant, but there's no email that stays steady year after year because it changes from volunteer to volunteer, they don't always get the information. And so you might not get the data the policy people need. These towns may not get the information. They might not know there's help out there for them. So I think, still today, if you go on the League of Kansas Municipalities, you'll see smaller towns that you can't email. There's no email. It's hard to contact them. So we're looking for contacts in every town.
And even if there is a contact person, I think in the context of a local hospital or a local health department or EMS agency, that EMS in a lot of these small communities is volunteer-led as well, or volunteer service. So all the folks that are doing it have other jobs. They have other full-time jobs, and they do the service on top of it. They might, even in cases where they hear about this opportunity, there's this funding that we could apply for. It's a hard ask to further sort of eat into what little free available time you have to find the resources and to apply for that grant opportunity.
So, especially in public health, there is often a big focus on a multi-sector approach. Guess what? Rural Kansas is a multi-sector approach. However, it's not just the housing person and the economic development person and the health department person. They are actually the same person. And it turns out that it maybe by default, maybe by choice, maybe by being voluntold for the work. And also, it's very difficult when one person is doing all of those things. So even that shift and understanding how that work looks is really important.
So when we or organizations, we as like a state, a collective state, are trying to think about supporting rural communities that have the will and the gumption to help themselves, there can still be things that we could be cognizant of in how we design those opportunities and the requirements we put on those opportunities and how those are accessible or not accessible for small, particularly small communities where the one person might be wearing multiple hats and not have a formal grant writing background. Doesn't mean they couldn't be really successful in the project, but the way you maybe receive the money can be a barrier of the application.
That's so true. But we do see efforts. We see this rural issues, volunteer-led community issues being better understood and efforts being made. It's just so complex in the simplicity of it all.
So I wanna talk about something that you have a great visual cue for here, which was unprompted, unplanned, but you are wearing a shirt.
Oh,
that
yeah, I just happened to wear it.
So we're talking about some of the program areas, but underneath all of the work you do, there's some common threads, there's some common values, and we've talked about some of those already. One of the values that you have is that rural is not less than, and you think so much of that value that you even put it on a shirt. So can you tell me a little bit about that value and how that shows up in the different work in the different program areas?
Yeah, first of all, you'll be interested to know it was your board member, Christy Hopkins, that came up with this. She was one of our core Power Up people. And one day she just said, rural is not less than. And we all go, that needs to be a shirt. But it's that rallying cry. You just got to kind of get worked up about it. And, those of us who work rural, sometimes need to get a little fired up that we believe that. And we may be bucking the trend or what the majority think, and we know there's warts. So don't mistake that we think rural is all awesome. It has so much potential, but it is not less than, right?
Right. She also came up with the corollary phrase, rural Kansas just needs some swagger.
Yeah. So we need a shirt.
We probably do.
That could be a shirt too. And that's great. I think the shirt is fun, and what a fun connection that it came from Christy, who's wonderful and one of our board members out from Tribune in Western Kansas. One of the other program areas that you all have that shifts us from some of the work that you've been doing, and we talked some about the history, but it's really forward focused, is this idea of building thriving communities. And you just mentioned this value that, at least starting from the perspective of rural is not less than, but there are challenges, there are gaps, there are things that we can improve, there are warts, as you would say. So when you think about that program area and the work and building thriving communities, what are some of the ingredients that we need in thriving communities, and where maybe we need to do some work to find more of those ingredients or build those?
Let me set you up for this.
Okay.
So there's all these efforts to recruit people to rural. But our concern is once they get there, will they be happy? And we think that what we heard from those 175 interviewees helped us explain what a community of the future might look like that people who move there would find appealing. And some of those elements are?
Our shorthand way to talk about it is, does this place like itself? Any effort to get anyone back or to a rural community has to keep that in mind if it's going to be successful. Do you want to live in a place that doesn't like itself? Do you want to live in a place where people are like, ugh, don't move here because it's not great? The Power Up and Go report had 2 sections. One was policy recommendations for the most part. But the second part lifted up this idea that those things are important. Childcare is important. Broadband is important. But how people are welcomed, how people feel like they belong, how they can contribute, how they're not seen as fresh meat when they come in. And it's like, great, you're here. The church has a committee. The city has a committee. You can be in our Rotary Club. You can, it sounds welcoming, but it can also be really overwhelming. So it's the idea that these communities are diverse in culture, in thought, in how they treat one another. These are things that cost $0, it turns out. These are things that have everything to do with how you show up, how you keep welcoming someone, whether it's year 1, year 5, year 25. A lot of places where there isn't a lot of turnover. I have a friend in Western Kansas who's still new in town, and she's lived there for like 25 years at this point. And they still say, well, you're not from around here, because they know. And she will always be othered. She has made huge contributions to this place, enormous. And she's not from there.
So young people want inclusivity. They want to see the community investing in itself. It's just like they want community. They don't want factions. They don't want someone up there telling them how to do it. And it's hard. But until you suggest that these things can exist, or you should think about them, our conference coming up is, the theme is creating communities of the future. So we're going to be sharing about all these elements that don't cost.
And really, something we're trying to think about is just like the most basic action items. Like maybe you can't see yourself in, like recruiting a business to town, but you like to have people over for dinner. You have a role. Doesn't matter how old you are. Doesn't matter how long you've lived there. In fact, probably better if you've lived there a long time. You have a lot of power. What are you doing with it? And then how can you help others have more of that power too?
That 25, being in a community for 25 years and still being perceived as sort of not from here is sticking with me. And I think about to connect it to some common challenges we know in sort of the public healthcare space. One of those things is recruiting a physician. If you are lucky enough to have someone that you're recruiting that used to be from there, you're running into some of the challenges we talked about earlier. Oh, you couldn't make it in Chicago, so you came back. You decided to be a family doc here. But if you're not one of those communities that has a local kid that wants to come back, you might be trying to recruit someone that's never lived there. And if that's the feeling that they're going to have the entire time they're there, that's a challenge. And that's a barrier. And it probably makes keeping them there in the community for a long period of time more difficult.
And think about that example too. A physician in a small town comes in at a certain level of authority just because of their job. People know them, people will be aware of them. Okay, so what if you're not a physician and you don't have any authority, but you just want to live in a place where your kids can throw their bikes wherever they end up on the sidewalk of the down, that you want a certain place. And if you don't have that authority, you might also have an even harder time. And I think that's what is hard to see. It's really like, how do we help you feel like you belong?
Belong. Not just welcome.
Yeah.
But belong.
And I sometimes have wondered where some of that comes from for folks that have been in a community for a long time. And I think one thing that I have thought about is, for a long time, and still in many communities, especially our rural communities, the story they've seen and that they've experienced is one of loss. It's our schools got consolidated, so we lost some history. Our hospital left. Our business that was here moved to the bigger town down the road. And so when get in that sort of experience, one reaction, I think, can be to hold on to everything you have and to really want to protect it and keep the history, keep the traditions. And I think that there can be positives to that reaction. But one thing I think it can sometimes lead into is this hesitancy for change, for newness, for different way of thinking. And is that something what does that sound like to you?
We have a rule. It's called the reframe rule. And we talk about it at the first of every event we do, that we don't want to hear you talk on and on about how you lost your school. Let's reframe that about what you can do now. Because to talk about those things doesn't get you anywhere. It just makes you mad, makes you angry. It makes you feel less than. So we've got to work hard, and it's not easy to reframe it. I mean, it's easy to feel like you're getting picked on when you lose your school and you don't think you should have. And I get all that. And there needs to be a grieving process. But you need those people in the community that have the strength to say this has happened. If we want to be a healthy community, how can we reframe and move on? And that's what I mean about the complexity. Because they don't have paid, there's probably not a mental health clinic. There's probably, it's just got to be someone in the town that dares step up to buck all the negativity going on. And that's not easy.
And a lot of times it's the power-ups.
Yeah.
So our colleague, Simone Elder, we should also say,
yes,
we believe in supporting this age group. We talked about how it's a journey. Part of the journey now is that we have a staff person who has power up in her job title. Mm-hmm. And she is one. She has been one. Simone is the power up. Mm-hmm. So she gets it. She lives it. And how they show up in this is really fascinating. Simone and I spoke to a group yesterday, and she and I talk a lot. I'm in a transition plan right now too. What do we pull forward while we're creating this community of the future? It's not throw everything out at all by any means. We like this stuff. I mean, we're here for a reason. We're choosing to live for a reason. It's not just a wholesale, let's get rid of it all and start from scratch. Mm-hmm. It's how we honor the past, but see ourselves for who we are and who we can be, and it's putting those pieces together a lot of the time.
You're talking about our nonprofit, but you're also talking about a community.
Yeah, well, yes.
That transitions. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a good analogy.
And that work, you use the word complex. I think about the way we, at maybe a state level or a large organization level, might view, again, this from the outside looking at how we might view helping or supporting a rural community. And the tendency to try to find that one thing they need, that if they had the business or if they had the hospital or if they had this, and all those things can contribute. But the real work is sort of underneath that. It's how you're thinking about your community, how you're building connections, how you're thinking about the future, how you're pulling in the good from the past and finding new ways to do it. And that takes more time. And that has to be built on and involve the expertise and the lived experience of the folks right there in that community.
Because you can't come in and be an expert and say all the programs that have worked in a larger town because of all the volunteer-led characteristics. So first of all, you have to see that community for who it is, what it is. They want to feel like you see them. And now maybe if you can come talk to us about what we can do with our capacity, maybe we can move it forward.
You talked earlier about a big assumption, which is this is a small town, so everybody knows everyone else. Yes, you would maybe be surprised to know that we could be in a very small town and realize that people are not talking about.
They must not like each other, that town.
Right.
And yeah, it's one of those assumptions that I hear, and I even hear when I tell people where I'm from. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the comment is, oh, I don't know if I could live there. And that's usually followed by, everyone must have known everything that was going on. And like, there are relative things to this, but a lot of times I point out that especially those committed leaders that are doing this work, oftentimes you're so focused on trying to do the important work you're doing that you don't, they're busy. You might not have time to know everyone. You might not have had time to go talk to the new family. And we sort of assume that just because there's smaller people, that things are simpler or less complex and there's less going on. So, and I think that's a misconception that can sometimes get in the way in how we approach doing this work, is we assume that things are simple and less nuanced when they really aren't.
And then there's the invisible people with poverty, immigrants that kind of tend to hide. So if your community doesn't feel welcoming, they're going to be more hidden. And how well do you really know your neighbors? You know, do you spend time really getting to know them, or just, we see that you have 2 trucks that don't work anymore in the driveway and we don't like that, but why, you know? Anyway, yeah, there's a stereotype, isn't there? We know everybody, know all the stuff that goes on.
So we've talked some about the challenges and some of the misconceptions or some of these sort of approaches that folks have that impact this work. I want to shift a little bit, because I know you all get the opportunity, and you talked before we actually got on camera that you're doing some onboarding, and you get to do some very fun onboarding where you get to visit all of those incorporated places. Every single one in the state. And I can only imagine some of the fun stories and experiences you've had. Are there any that really stand out where maybe you went into a community for the first time and you went, wow, I never would have thought in this place that they'd have this wonderful thing, or I'd meet this wonderful person? Is there any fun story like that you want to share?
Wow.
Do you want me to go?
Yes, I do.
So who would expect that a post office would be the mental health clinic, the social gathering place? But we'll even say the town. We went into Little River, and we had visited around. It was going great. And then we decided to go to the post office. And that place was crowded. We wanted to talk to the clerk, but the window, there were 3 stools there, and little kids were on them. And it looked like they go every day. And Lori had candy, you know, but this was in the summer. And one kid was like 6, 9, and 10. And the parents just say, go get our mail. They bike downtown. And then birthday people were coming in. And it was just kind of magical that the post office, and this post office clerk was like the welcome wagon lady. I mean, she just put love out there. In another town, the post office there's no other businesses. So the only people that more isolated people saw during the day would be the post office lady. And she would take time to hear their issues or hear a joke or make sure they were okay if they didn't come in. And we have a lot of good post office stories. Can you think of another one?
We went to one town, and we're having so we're trying to talk to at least one person everywhere. And we're mostly successful. There are some places that it's hard, but it's not because if you go into a town in the middle of the day and it's empty, it's not because nobody lives there, and it's not because nobody likes living there. We went to, can I say the name?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we went to Wilmore, which is population 31, 33, somewhere in there. And this place loves itself. It loves itself so much. They have these cool things. So in the background of all of this, we have this Kansas Explorers Club to help people get out and do what we call explorer-y things. There's a family in this town. They kind of divide their time between Wilmore and elsewhere, but they always wanted to have a carousel. So they put a carousel in.
They went to Texas to get it.
Yeah, it's the most beautiful, like hand-painted, like old school carousel. There's a nice enclosure around it. If they're home, you honk and they will come out and let you ride on their carousel. And that's it. So like, that's cool. The people who live there work somewhere else. They're commuters as much as anyone who lives in Topeka, Kansas City. They're commuting somewhere else to work. There's not necessarily businesses. There is like a general store in town. But everything's mowed. There are nice painted quilt blocks on the light poles. It is a nice place, and you can tell it is a nice place, even though no one is there. They're just somewhere else during the day. And
yeah, you can just feel it.
Yeah.
So we've heard a lot about so many things, and I love the stories, and I have a special affinity for post offices. One of my parents works for a post office, and they reach all of the community, so they can be wonderful eyes and ears to connect with folks. So thank you for some of those stories. I want to end with sort of looking even more to the future. So we talked about some of the current work you're doing, some of the history. In the next 10, 15, 20 years, what are some of the hopes for what the work looks like for the Kansas Sampler Foundation?
I just want to say that because we believe in this work so much, we've done this transition to bring in Sarah and Simone to continue the work. So I think on this road trip, you see all the potential of what can be done yet. But I'll turn that question over to you.
It's a lot of faith in the work and in the people. Marcy always says the answers are on the road. And the trip that we're on, the previous ones, there's a book. You can see it. This is literally about trying to understand what's going on right now. So we, policymakers, funders, Kansans, can do some things now to get ready for the future. Everyone knows that Northeast Kansas is big and getting bigger. We know. It's not about reversing population trends. It's not, there are places where that would be great. How do we keep listening? How do we keep putting these communities at the center of their own story to make their own decisions, to make their own choices, to make sure they have agency to do their work? And it's about getting them what they need. Sometimes it's money, but sometimes it's a friend for the 25-year-old economic development director who's having a real tough time right now. And if we can help her, that's a systems change. So finding people, listening to them, supporting them, connecting them. That is what you've always done. And we're going to keep doing that.
And that's what we're doing to reframe the future of rural.
Oh, that's wonderful. What a great way to end a really great conversation. I thank you both so much for being such gracious hosts, having us here, and for sharing all of your amazing wisdom and insights with us. We really appreciate it.
We appreciate your interest.
You just heard Health on the Plains. Look for new episodes twice per month. Follow us on social media and continue to listen to the latest episodes wherever you regularly listen to podcasts. Learn more at khi.org/podcast. Thanks for listening.